In the twilight of an October evening, 1881, John Smith made his way home. As he crossed Church Street, something happened. The driver of Toronto Street railcar number 65, the car Smith had just left, turned his horses around at Bloor and started them on their return run south. With few passengers on board, the horses moved swiftly through the cool autumn air.
At about 8 o'clock in the evening, I was standing in the gateway of Mr. Smith's residence when I looked up the street and saw several persons looking at something on the ground. I went up to the place and found it was the body of Mr. Smith. He was quite dead, lying between the tracks. That is all that I know about it, and it is a perfect mystery to me how the accident happened.
Smith's body was buried at the new cemetery to the north of Toronto. A short time after, a magnificent monument was erected in his memory. No one ever really knew what happened to Smith that night, and by and large, John Smith has little bearing on our lives today. But over 100 years later, John Smith is not forgotten.
There are any number of reasons why we have not forgotten John Smith. It certainly isn't the unique quality of his name. It could be that John Smith had a son who had a son who had a son who now speaks about his great-grandfather and his unfortunate encounter with the Toronto Street Rail Company. But more than likely, we remember John Smith because his name was carved in stone, and that stone still remains as a reminder of the man and his story. There's a place in Toronto that holds thousands of stones, thousands of stories, and thousands of reminders of lives that have gone before. In Toronto, there's a place where the past is held in trust, waiting to be remembered. Mount Pleasant, considered by many to be the grandest and most beautiful cemetery in the province, if not the continent. A lot of people are surprised to learn that it is not a private institution, but a part of a series of local public burial grounds, all born of a sense of community. It all began with a commitment made over a century and a half ago.
Order, please.
A meeting of the inhabitants of York Friendly to the purchasing of a public burial place for all classes and sects was held on the evening of Monday the 14th of November, 1825. The Select Committee, appointed to purchase a burying ground, reported that they had selected and bought 6 acres on Yonge Street, about a mile from town.
William Lyon Mackenzie was announcing the coming of the York General Burying Ground, the first in a series of public cemeteries. It wasn't Mount Pleasant Cemetery, but in a way the grandfather of Mount Pleasant. The citizens of York had formed a trust with a simple commitment. They were to provide their little community with a place for non-profit, non-sectarian public burials. At the time, with a local population of 1,500, the task seemed simple enough. But things would change. The little town of York soon became the blossoming city of Toronto. In 20 years, the population increased over tenfold, and what was once a sparse pioneer graveyard had become a cemetery so full that it hindered the growth of neighboring Yorkville. It was time to move on.
Gentlemen, following the closure of the York General Burying Ground, we turn to the necropolis for our city's non-sectarian burials. However, in the 15 years since, Toronto's growth has proven too great for this picturesque cemetery, and we are again facing a shortage of public burial space. If we are to serve our public, we, the trustees, must think to the future. Let us seek out a new property that reflects the true potential growth of this fine city.
In 1873, they found the place. For $20,000, William McMaster and his fellow trustees purchased a 200-acre tract of land below the community of Davisville. Now, 200 acres is not an inconsequential piece of land. As a spread of farmland, it was respectable size. As a cemetery, it was astounding. But the trustees were determined to see to it that their new cemetery would serve Toronto well into the future. The fact that there are still plots available to the public after a century in operation and after 160,000 internments is testimony to the scope of the trustees' foresight. But not even the trustees could have imagined the incredible stories that would find their way into the new cemetery. Stories that have come to define Toronto's character and our nation's history.
Spring 1885.
Those half-breeds and Indians who have been forced to join the rebels, and also those mistaken Indians who have joined voluntarily, are informed by this proclamation that if they give up at once and return to their houses and reserves, they will be pardoned. The troops sent by the government do not desire to make war against these men, but only against Riel, his council, and his principal accomplices.
In less than 9 days, thousands of government soldiers were converging on Riel and his following. Led by Middleton, the Canadian troops included Toronto's own 10th Royal Grenadiers, a formidable force of over 270 men.
Dear Mother and Father, Riel is strongly entrenched, but we will lick him in time. I believe the Fenians are helping him. It was a sad sight to see our men burying the dead yesterday. I cannot tell you half in writing, but will tell you all when I get home. Your affectionate son, Thomas Moore.
I was 12 feet from poor Moore when he was shot. He lived 6 hours, but did not know any of us.
As the sun rose the following morning, Middleton ordered his colonel to prepare for a frontal assault.
I was beside Lieutenant Fitch in the charge. He was in command of our company, and all our fellows liked him. When the bullet hit him, he fell on his face with just a groan. After that, the Grenadiers would have gone through anything for him.
So fierce was the attack that the soldiers fell over themselves to get at the enemy. The rebels made a full retreat. Riel and his men disappeared into the surrounding woodlands. The Northwest Rebellion was over. The bodies of Lieutenant Fitch and Private Moore were loaded onto trains for the long journey back east, and Louis Riel surrendered to the RCMP.
The sentence of the court upon you, Louis Riel, is that you be taken to the guardroom of the mounted police in Regina, and from thence to the place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck until dead. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul.
In the months that followed, Quebec put intense pressure on John A. Macdonald to reduce Riel's sentence to life imprisonment. Nonetheless, Riel was hanged on November the 16th, 1885. In the end, Macdonald could not turn his back on the will of Toronto, a city that was rapidly proving itself to be the Dominion's commercial and manufacturing center. A city that could not readily forgive the death of their sons, Thomas Moore and William Fitch.
Today, Mount Pleasant is still distinguished by its great size. especially when you consider that its 200 acres now lie in the heart of some of Toronto's most prominent real estate. But what really sets Mount Pleasant apart is its beautifully crafted landscape. After purchasing the property in 1873, the trustees assigned $40,000 to landscape design and development, a huge amount of money at the time. They hired a landscape architect named Henry Engelhardt, a Prussian-born designer who had gained quite a reputation in the northern states and southern Ontario. Engelhardt was hardworking, scrupulous, and forthright, and maybe just a little cantankerous.
Mr. Engelhardt, in his profession, has few superiors on the continent. His work only needs to be known to be properly appreciated.
Engelhardt's designs for Mount Pleasant changed the way people looked at cemeteries. Functionality, aesthetics, and service of community needs were all carefully considered in his plans.
Mr. Engelhardt, the architect, has succeeded in a very short time in transforming a large portion of the grounds into a most park-like spot, with winding roadways and paths diverging in almost every direction. Directors may congratulate themselves in having secured the services of a man so thoroughly competent in his profession.
Engelhardt was a true visionary, and he wouldn't have anything blocking his vision. Breaking a long-standing tradition in cemetery management, Engelhardt initiated a rule strictly forbidding the construction of fences around family plots. In fact, it has even been suggested that if Engelhardt had his way, monuments would have been altogether forbidden. But what Engelhardt may not have appreciated was the fact that it is the monuments that remind us of our past, of people like, well, Henry Engelhardt, or battalions like the 48th Highlanders, or of events like that of May 29th, 1914.
By midnight, the great liner Empress of Ireland was well on its way down the St. Lawrence. Most of the 1,000-plus passengers had turned in for the evening, including 192 representatives of Toronto's Salvation Army, who were making the trip to London for their World Congress. Captain John Kendall strolled the deck of his ship.
It's a nice night, but it looks to me as though a fog is coming. You never know how soon a fog drops its pall upon you at this part of the river. We should show some care.
Downriver, the Norwegian coal ship Storstad was steaming westward, its hold filled to capacity with Nova Scotian coal. The Storstad and the Empress were within visual distance when the fog bank rolled over them. Both crews knew of the other's whereabouts, so a safe passing was a simple matter. It was only moments before the collision, when the Storstad's running lights appeared in the dense fog, that anyone knew something had gone wrong. It was too late. The bow of the Storstad ripped into the side of the Empress of Ireland. The Storstad pulled back from the gash, leaving a good portion of the Empress open to the cold water of the St. Lawrence. The liner began to list immediately. Any thought of making a run for the shore was cut short when thousands of gallons of water hit the engine room. Everything went dead.
The first thing that woke us up was a large explosion by the porthole. We had quite a bit of difficulty getting up to the deck because the boat was listing. We couldn't use lifeboats. There wasn't time. So we just sat and waited. Everything was quiet. I think people were praying.
10 minutes had passed since the collision. The tilt of the damaged ship made the launching of over half the lifeboats impossible. Hundreds of passengers were trapped below deck as the ship continued to founder.
I managed to get out of my stateroom, but I was unable to walk up the alleyway because of the list of the boat. I tried to crawl, but could not, so I scrambled along the wall and grasped a porthole. I got my head out, and what was my astonishment to find the side crowded with people, standing there as if it were the deck. There were fully 100 people around me.
Seconds later, the ship lurched for the last time. It had been a mere 14 minutes since the collision. Anyone standing on the side of the ship was thrown into the bone-chilling water. Anyone still inside traveled with the Empress down the 16 fathoms to the bottom of the St. Lawrence.
The ship pulled from under and we were struggling in the water. And then the fog that had been around us, just as the boat sank, as though it had accomplished its purpose, rolled up like a curtain.
1,027 perished that night. More passengers than were lost on the Titanic 2 years earlier. Toronto felt the loss of almost 200 souls, 167 of which were members of the Salvation Army. A loss that will never be forgotten.
Welcome! Good day all, and welcome to Mount Pleasant Cemetery.
It was a cold November Saturday in 1876 when Mount Pleasant finally opened its gates to the people of Toronto.
The members of the board hereby notify the citizens generally and their representatives that the cemetery is now open for the inspection of all who may be desirous to see the arrangements made for the public convenience or to select lots for the burial of their dead.
Mount Pleasant received nothing but accolades when it opened. It was beautiful, spacious, relaxing, and removed from the chaos of the city. Thankfully, some things never change. One change that has dramatically affected Mount Pleasant occurred gradually over generations. In keeping with Englehart's original scheme, Mount Pleasant has cultivated one of the finest collections of trees on the continent. Every type of tree, both foreign and domestic, that will grow in Toronto's climate is represented, culminating in over 200 different species, one of the foremost arboretums of its kind in North America. Some may find irony in the fact that a place where we bury our dead contains such life. But Mount Pleasant is a place for the living. By opening its gates to joggers, cyclists, and other recreation seekers, Mount Pleasant gives people the opportunity to reflect on the past, and maybe even consider their own mortality, all in an environment that encourages us to enjoy life.
"7 o'clock in the evening, the day before Christmas Eve, 1914. The Reverend J. McPherson Scott gathered several Christmas gifts and left his Broadview residence for a prayer meeting at St. John's Presbyterian Church. Scott was about a block from home when he saw a familiar face in the shadows, Harry Asher. Then he saw the gun. The first shot threw Scott off balance. Then came the second. Dropping everything, Scott stumbled desperately into the street to escape. Asher followed right behind. A patch of ice brought Scott down. Again, he faced the revolver. Two teenage boys heard the shots and came running. The gunman was easily captured. Filled with paranoid delusions, Harry Asher came to believe that Toronto's Presbyterian community had plotted against him. What better revenge than to kill the most visible member of that church? The police carried Reverend Scott back to his residence, where he was treated by Dr. Sneath. But the doctor could not believe his eyes. Every bullet found its target, yet only one hit the man.
Without any warning, he fired twice in quick succession, and so close to my body that my overcoat was burned. The second shot was well aimed for the heart. These shots struck a steel spectacle case carried in my upper left pocket, crumpling the case, smashing the spectacles, and making a superficial flesh wound. These two shots were followed by two others, one that went through the hem of my coat, the other the sleeve.
It was only when the Reverend fell on the ice that the assassin was able to make one hit in the hip. Reverend Scott lived on, continuing his ministry at St. James Presbyterian and his seemingly endless work with the needy. Toronto will never forget the name of such a selflessly driven man, just as J. Macpherson Scott would never forget the miraculous Christmas of 1914.
This children's garden is an endpoint in the essential grieving process of a parent for the loss of her child. Out of this grieving process has come my victory over death, a richer appreciation and love of life. With the help of friends, I decided to create a children's garden as a memorial to the children buried there, a garden that, like children, will always be growing and changing.
The year was 1919, and little Leonard Allen passed away after only 5 months of life. Following a brief funeral service, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Allen made their way to Mount Pleasant Cemetery by motorcade. Leonard's remains, however, were taken south to the foot of Bathurst Street. His tiny coffin was strapped into the front seat of a Toronto-built Curtiss JN-4 biplane. Harold Smith, a veteran of the Royal Flying Corps, piloted the craft up to the cemetery. Why this unusual mode of transport was used for Leonard Allen's funeral remains largely unclear. These arrangements may have been requested by the baby's parents who desperately sought a way to give their son's short life meaning, to include him in the brave new world. Regardless of the reasons, on September the 3rd, 1919, Leonard Allen's journey marked the first aerial funeral in the history of the world.
In 1917, the architectural firm of Darling and Pearson went to work on a mausoleum for Mount Pleasant. Officially opened in 1920, it now holds the remains of over 1,000 people. It stands as a reminder that there are alternatives to burying our dead, but the quiet dignity of architecture can be as much a tribute to people of the past as the natural beauty that is found in the rest of Mount Pleasant.
The year was 1933, and Toronto was suffering the devastation of the Great Depression. Unemployment reached beyond 30%. Food was priced at a premium, and for some, housing became an unaffordable luxury. Nonetheless, thousands of Canadians swarmed to the big city looking for relief. It is no surprise that some of the truly desperate turned to crime. On the evening of November the 30th, 1933, the family of Dr. Charles Kopp were enjoying a typical Thursday night. Dr. Kopp's eldest son, Johnny, was on his way to the phone when he caught a glimpse of a prowler trying to pry open a second-floor window. Jumping down off the veranda roof, the burglar hit the ground running, but the varsity halfback was on him in no time. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Bleeding from the abdomen, Johnny dropped to one knee as his opponent disappeared over the back fence into the labyrinth of dark lanes south of the house. The .32 caliber slug had run roughshod through the lad's intestines. The surgeons who removed the bullet gave him a 50-50 chance. Less than 20 hours later, Johnny's pulse quickened to the point that it could no longer be counted. Shortly thereafter, John Charles Henry Kopp slipped into unconsciousness and never awakened. The murderer's description spread across the city. Hundreds were taken in for questioning. All buses and automobiles trying to leave the city were detained. A $5,000 reward was posted. The city became a blanket of suspicion and interrogation.
We are endeavoring to maintain Toronto's reputation as a fine place to live. I ask all citizens to assist in bringing the murderer to the bar of justice.
All Toronto agonized over the loss of Johnny Kopp. Here was a young man in his prime, a final-year medical student and a star player for the Varsity Blues football team. His death was more than a crime. Johnny Kopp's death embodied the feelings of hurt and waste that plagued the people of the Great Depression. As for the murderer, the police would continue their search in vain. No one would ever be charged. The Noronic, Queen of the Inland Seas, pride of the Canadian steamship lines, moored at Toronto's Pier 9. It appeared as it had for much of its 35 years' service. 5 decks of wood paneling, shiny brass, and fresh paint. Late in the evening on September the 16th, 1949, the mood on board was festive amongst the 524 passengers, most of whom were from Detroit and Cleveland. 2:25 a.m., Don Church was making his way to his cabin on sea deck when he noticed a thin ribbon of smoke winding up from beneath a linen closet door.
The crewman ran back and opened the linen locker door, and the flame shot out, and he fell back over me. As I lay there, I saw flames going toward the stern. They flowed around the corner like a stream of water. I felt if I didn't get out now, I would never get out.
By the time the fire department arrived, the flames had a 20-minute head start. The Noronic was an inferno.
The fire seemed to shoot through the back part of the Noronic all of a sudden. Within 2 minutes, about 2/3 of the ship seemed to be engulfed. It just went off like the head of a match.
At first, the gangways were accessible and dozens found their way to safety without trouble. But it wasn't long before every safe escape route was cut off by the flames. People then jumped ship. Those on the upper decks had a grim choice. To leap from the starboard side was to land on a concrete pier and to suffer the consequences. To leap from the port side was to plunge into pitch black water below. It was a frantic effort. People leapt from every point on the ship. Every hook and ladder truck available was called to the scene to pluck people from the decks. Water taxis, rafts, and even milk kegs were thrown into the water to help rescue those who had gone overboard. Burned and broken victims were carried away in ambulances, trucks, and cabs. It was, without a doubt, the most horrific scene ever witnessed in Toronto. By morning, The Noronha was a burnt-out hulk. Firefighters painstakingly searched the wreckage for victims, transporting the remains to a makeshift morgue on the exhibition grounds. The days that followed were no less difficult. The intensity of the fire made identification of the bodies nearly impossible. In the end, 118 died in the Noronha fire. Miraculously, only one person died in the water. 4 months after the Holocaust, 15 bodies were buried at Mount Pleasant. The partial remains and ashes of dozens were also buried under a stone dedicated to the victims of the fire. It was a final gesture made in a city that had never before experienced such a tragedy.
Toronto really is an amazing city with a proud and exciting past. And Mount Pleasant Cemetery is well suited in its role as guardian of the city's history. Like Toronto, it was born from a sense of community, welcoming anyone and everyone who chose to be a part of it. It's a place where the past is respected and where the present can be enjoyed by young and old alike. Mount Pleasant, a place where the past is held in trust, waiting to be remembered.